It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Sharon Palmer is one of the most highly respected dietitians in the media today. She is passionate about healthy plant-based nutrition that is delicious and accessible. Sharon is known for her enthusiastic and articulate approaches in spreading the word about the benefits of plant-based diets. For our health and for the health of the planet, Sharon communicates science-based nutritional information through her consulting, public speaking, and writing skills. She is an accomplished writer on topics such as plant-based diets, hunger, agriculture, local and organic food, eco-friendly culinary practices, sustainability, food safety, and food security. She is the author of the books The Plant-Powered Diet and her new book, Plant-Powered for Life. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Sharon Palmer.
Thank you. Thank you so much and good afternoon. I'm happy to be speaking about plant-powered diets and inflammation. It's just one of the many benefits of a plant-based diet is fighting inflammation. But first of all, I want to introduce you to my own plant-powered family. These are my parents in the center. They're in their 80s and they're kicking strong, and they've been on plant-based diet pretty much their whole lives. My two sons, my teenage strapping sons, and they're plant-based eaters as well. This is a picture of me 2 weeks ago at the Heirloom Conference in Santa Rosa. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's an amazing conference celebrating heirloom vegetables, and this is my favorite topic, is eating more fruits and vegetables. This is actually a tower of heirloom vegetables. I was inspired to pursue my career in plant-based nutrition and nutrition in general. I studied at Loma Linda University, which has a meat-free campus. It's one of the blue zones. I don't know if you've heard of the blue zones. They're populations where they have a longer lifespan, and they have characteristics in their lifestyle that afford that, one of them being plant-based nutrition. So I studied there, and I've worked in hospitals and clinics before really working in journalism for the last 13 years. So that's a little bit about me, but anti-inflammatory diets are really hot right now. It's a huge topic. In fact, I Googled anti-inflammatory diets and I got 1.3 million hits. It's that popular. And I found 574 books on Amazon with the topic anti-inflammatory diets. And it's recommended by a lot of the top diet gurus such as Dr. Weil and Dr. Sears. It was identified as a top diet trend by Food Channel, and anti-inflammatory diets are recommended to treat a number of conditions such as Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, and even injuries. And these are a few books titles that you can see with anti-inflammatory diets in the title. Well, there is a lot of credible information on anti-inflammatory diets. Like, for instance, this is from a colleague of mine, Carrie Glassman. I don't have the live feed here, but you could Google it. She has a really nice short YouTube from her report on CBS Health Watch. She has a gorgeous display of fruits and vegetables talking about what an anti-inflammatory diet is. A very well done piece. But then you can find a lot of other stuff out there on the internet where people aren't quite getting it right. I just found one thing, somebody had a YouTube video about their anti-inflammatory juice acne cleanse. And not a lot of evidence behind that, but you'll see a lot out there. So there's a lot of confusion that we can help people with. So what is the consensus on inflammation and health? When I first started studying nutrition, this wasn't something we knew a lot about, but it is growing and growing. There's more and more data coming out, more research, more studies on inflammation. This is what the American Heart Association says. Although it's not proven that inflammation causes cardiovascular disease, inflammation is common for heart disease and stroke patients, and it's thought to be a sign of atherogenic response. So that's their formal statement. American Institute for Cancer Research, this is what they say. Findings from laboratory studies have shown that phytochemicals have the potential to reduce the kind of inflammation that makes cancer growth more likely. So we have some of the major organizations saying that, we're starting to learn more, and most scientists agree that we need more research on understanding how inflammation impacts health, but we're starting to get there. I'm going to show you some slides of my favorite anti-inflammatory foods as we're going through to break up all the boring slides. This is a picture I took in Sweden last summer, and it was just this beautiful display of organic produce in front of a restaurant. And these are all the beautiful anti-inflammatory foods that we can enjoy every day. So what is inflammation? Well, let's get to the basics. Acute inflammation is good. There are basically two kinds of inflammation, and the acute inflammation is what your body needs to have as a defense system. It's a good thing. It's your natural pro-inflammatory immune response when you're faced with an injury or an assault. The classic example is when you get a splinter in your finger. That's an inflammatory response. A cascade of events occur to fight the infection and to push out that foreign invader. It occurs with pain, swelling, redness. These are all things that your body does to help fend off that invader or an infection or whatever is coming its way. And this is a good, healthy response. We need this. But there's also a second kind of inflammation, and that's the chronic inflammation. That's what we're talking about today. It's not so good. It's more recently recognized that this chronic, low-level inflammation, that's a simmering inflammation below the threshold of pain, is damaging to the body. It's often called silent inflammation, and it's when the inflammatory response is triggered for no real reason or threat. And it can just last for days, weeks, months. And as it's simmering there, it's causing damage to the organs, damage to the tissues, which leads to chronic disease. So it's this slow simmering inflammation that we want to try to avoid. And we also know that inflammation has a root in many diseases. And this is evidence-based. This is scientifically based, that inflammation is a root in the diseases that I've listed here. For instance, cardio and cerebrovascular diseases has a root in inflammation. Alzheimer's, diabetes, arthritis, autoimmune diseases, neurological diseases, pulmonary diseases, and cancer, they all have a root in inflammation. And it's important to note that obesity itself is a pro-inflammatory state. And obesity has a root in many of these diseases. So it all is fitting hand in hand. This is also in Sweden, this gorgeous display of anti-inflammatory foods. Okay, so as we were learning more about inflammation, we needed to have biomarkers to measure it. So we have clinical biomarkers, and probably the one that people know the best is CRP, C-reactive protein. It's not a perfect biomarker because sometimes it measures other things going on, but it's inexpensive and it's easy to do. We have other biomarkers that researchers are also looking at, measuring levels of inflammation so that we can understand it better, how to reduce it. So in the case of CRP, it's an acute phase protein that's produced by the liver in response to cytokine production during illness, infection, injury, or general inflammation. And as I mentioned, there are many other biomarkers that are being measured as well. So here's an example of an inflammatory process in atherosclerosis. So you can see how inflammation is a root in atherosclerosis. This diagram shows the development of an atherosclerotic plaque and all the events and the biomarkers. I'm not sure if you can see it, but you can see that those are all biomarkers of inflammation that occur at the stages of the development of the plaque. So this is something that was published, and you can see that inflammation is happening all the way along that process. So we have many studies that look at cardiovascular disease and stroke and how inflammation plays a role. This is just an example of a few studies here. There was a review that found inflammatory biomarkers predicted the risk of stroke in this particular review. There was a study in adolescents that found CVD risk was associated with inflammatory biomarkers such as these. The risk of hypertension was increased with CRP and IL-6, both biomarkers of inflammation. And the other interesting thing is that now we know that oxidative stress, which again is another root of chronic disease, the free radicals damage the cells and produce damage to the tissues and eventually chronic disease. Oxidative stress leads to inflammation, inflammation leads to oxidative stress. So they go hand in hand. So all of these roots of chronic disease are going hand in hand, working together to damage the tissues. This is a vegetarian restaurant sign that I just love. And this was in Sweden too. When I was in Sweden last summer, the vegetarian movement's doing really well there. 10% of Swedes are vegetarian now, 5% vegan, which is very interesting, more than we have here. Okay, so inflammation and cancer. There's some interesting research in this field. Epi-evidence has connected the inflammation with cancer for a while. We've known that long-term inflammation can lead to cancer, and we have examples of that, such as HPV leading to cervical cancer, H. pylori leading to gastric cancer. It just makes sense that this long-term inflammation that you see leads to the development of tumors. And we also know that pre-malignant tumors are wound-like in characteristics. 1/5 of the worldwide cancer incidence is associated with microbial infection. So there's this connection with infection, inflammation, and cancer. And a classic example is the chronic irritation and inflammation seen with things like cigarette smoke, asbestos, that developing into cancer. There's a chronic inflammation aspect to that development. We also know from research that inflammatory mediators stimulate tumor cell growth and that tumors develop and progress with inflammatory disease. There's also something that the researchers have identified as the injury-inflammation cancer pathway. So that recurrent injuries due to all sorts of things, lifestyle, eating poorly, alcohol abuse, smoking, unhealthy diet, genetic susceptibility, but this recurrent injury develops this pro-inflammatory environment, which in turn leads to cancer development. These beautiful heirloom tomatoes, a perfect example of anti-inflammatory eating. Okay, weight. We mentioned that briefly, but weight and inflammation are correlated as well. Studies have shown that BMI and adiposity are linked with elevated CRP. So inflammation is happening with higher BMI and higher body fat. It's also related to metabolic syndrome factors. And now we know that fat cells actually secrete pro-inflammatory compounds. So this may be one of the reasons why inflammation occurs with obesity. And studies show that when people lose weight, their inflammation levels go down. Diabetes and inflammation has a connection too. As everybody knows, type 2 diabetes is rising. Right now, 9.3% of the entire population, that's everybody, has it. And it's an inflammatory disease as well. It shares many of the same outcomes as cardiovascular disease. Insulin resistance in obesity is accompanied with inflammation. That's what the research shows. And pro-inflammatory compounds that are increased in the adipose tissue are linked to inflammation, which then produce insulin resistance. It's all connected. The insulin resistance, the inflammation, the increased adiposity. So these are anti-inflammatory herbs that I saw in a farmer's market in Oxnard, and we know that these herbs are so high in compounds, which we'll be talking more about that soon. What's really interesting is the connection of inflammation and Alzheimer's. It's very well established that it has a deep root in the development of Alzheimer's. Inflammation occurs in the vulnerable regions of the Alzheimer's brain, and the classic hallmark signs of Alzheimer's disease: damaged neurons and neurites, amyloid beta peptide, neurofibrillary tangles. These all stimulate inflammation in the brain. Inflammation is present in the Alzheimer's brain all the way through, from preclinical to terminal stages. The inflammation is in the brain. And over many years, the inflammation is exacerbating the pathogenic process that even gets Alzheimer's started. So inflammation is a very big part of Alzheimer's. And this research has been established in many areas. It's been seen in autopsies, in vivo, in imaging, epi data, even like histologic and biochemical data support the fact that inflammation is going on throughout this whole process. So we talked about all these disease conditions, but now let's talk about diet and what we can do about it. This is the fun part. I really like this study. It was done in 2006, but it looked at the diet pattern and how diet pattern can impact inflammation. And what they looked at is a Western-style diet. And have you heard that term, Western diet? You've heard that term. It's really the way Americans eat. We talked about it at lunch. It would have been a typical Western meal would have been a hamburger and fries and a Coke. So the Western diet is a diet pattern that scientists actually use to study nutrition and outcomes. And it's this typical processed, high animal food, high saturated fat, high sodium diet with very few whole plant foods. It doesn't have very much fiber. It doesn't have very many phytochemicals, low fruits and vegetables. This is the typical Western diet. It's the way we eat in America, and it's also the way the diet pattern in Europe as well. And it's being exported. It's more and more happening in industrialized nations too. So this diet pattern was associated with turning on the inflammatory response in this study. But in the same study, the diet that was rich in whole plant foods with healthy carbs, healthy fat and protein sources, along with regular exercise and not smoking, actually reduced the inflammation. So this really looked at a diet pattern, an overall diet pattern that was linked with lowering inflammation versus increasing it. So why should we really care about anti-inflammatory eating? Well, I think it's really critical to reduce disease risk reduction. I showed you all the different factors that inflammation is involved with in the development of disease. So we could really make a dent on chronic disease by reducing inflammation. And diet plays a significant role in reducing inflammation. Studies are showing that what we eat can make a huge difference. Plant foods are linked with a number of health benefits. Studies after studies after studies find that eating more plant foods, whole plant foods, lower your risk of chronic disease. And maybe inflammation is just one of the aspects behind it. It's one of the factors why eating a plant-based diet is good for us. This is a picture of heirloom beans from Santa Rosa. I thought they were gorgeous. Anti-inflammatory eating. Okay, diet patterns and inflammation. I already mentioned a little bit about that Western diet. This is a more recent study that compared 3 different breakfasts: the Western breakfast, that high saturated fat, high animal food, high processed food, versus a Mediterranean-style diet with olive oil or walnuts. So the Mediterranean-style diet is very plant-based. And of course, the Western had the highest inflammatory response. So it's really backing up this whole idea that that diet is not the diet that we should be eating for inflammation. There are also other reviews that have found Mediterranean and DASH diets. The DASH diet is a diet that was originally intended to help reduce hypertension, but it's also a pretty plant-based diet, and it's been shown to have other benefits as well. But both Mediterranean and DASH diets in research have been shown to lower inflammation. And also, vegetarian diets have been shown to lower CRP. And we have more data coming on that too. The Adventist Health Study 2 has also found that the plant-based diets, the vegetarian and vegan diets, have lower inflammation levels. So that's pretty well established there. I really like these 3 sentences from Michael Pollan. I don't know if you've heard them. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And this is what health experts are going to now. It's so simple. These are summer squash from Pike's Place Market this summer, anti-inflammatory eating. So this is really could be one reason why we get this anti-inflammatory protection from all the plant foods, and it's the phytochemicals. When I was studying nutrition, we didn't really know that much about phytochemicals, but in the last couple of decades, our knowledge has expanded so much. Now, we've identified thousands of phytochemicals, and the scientists are discovering new ones too. They're all part of the plant matrix, and they work together in synergy, and they're amazing. This is a diagram of the categories of phytochemicals. So there are a huge number of flavonoids, and you can see where they all fit under the different categories. Phenolic acids, some of the more popular ones like anthocyanins are under the flavonoid category. And then things like catechins are the things found in tea. Those fall under flavanol category. But it's just to show you that we have this amazing classification of phytochemicals. And the thing that's interesting is that phytochemicals started out as a benefit to the plant. Because as plants grew throughout Earth's history, they had no natural defense. They couldn't get out and run away from their predator. They were rooted in the soil. You know, animals and people, we could always run away from whatever was threatening us, but the plants just had to sit there. So they had to develop their own defense system, and phytochemicals are their defense system. They act as UV protection, antibacterial protection, fungal, a natural pesticide. They act as antioxidants for plants. So that's how they started, and they give the plant the protection. They also work to attract pollinating insects, which help the survival of the plant. But what's interesting is when humans eat phytochemicals, we get all sorts of benefits too. Phytochemicals are only found in plant foods. They're antioxidants, they're anti-inflammatory agents, they enhance cell-to-cell communication, they alter estrogen metabolism favorably, they cause cancer cells to die in test tubes, they repair DNA damage, detoxify carcinogens. They do all these things, and a recent Tufts review, scientific review, found that people who eat large amounts of phytochemicals regularly have a reduced risk of several chronic diseases, such as neurodegenerative diseases, atherosclerosis, and cancer. So all these phytochemicals are so good for us, and they're found in plants. They're usually concentrated in the outer surface of the plant, the peel, where they could do the most protection for the plant on the outer surface. So when we eat our plants with the peels, we get more of them. Often they're the bright, colorful pigment of a plant too. So in the case of lycopene, which is found in tomatoes, they're actually the red pigment that gives tomatoes their bright red color. And when they're found in blueberries, it's the anthocyanins that's giving it that gorgeous, deep blue purple color. So, antioxidant-rich foods. A lot of these plant foods are also high in antioxidants. And as we were talking about before, antioxidants and anti-inflammatories, they work hand in hand because they help, oxidation can lead to inflammation and vice versa. So the antioxidant-rich foods are also good for us. And those are plant foods again. So antioxidants are like sponges. They mop up the free radicals in the bloodstream and help quiet the immune system. And they're found in plant foods. When we eat the rainbow, we want people to eat a variety of fruits and vegetables so that we get all of these antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. A lot of times they're found in really brightly colored foods, but they're also found in white vegetables too, like onions and garlic. So we can't just only say eat bright colored foods. We should eat them all of the plant foods. And also they're found in whole grains and legumes and nuts. But it's not just the antioxidants. Antioxidants were getting a lot of attention in the last couple of decades. Everybody was on a race to say which plant food had the highest level of antioxidants. One day it was blueberries, and then maybe the next day it was goji berries. But since then, we've kind of learned a little bit about antioxidants, and it's not just the measurement in a test tube. When you read the ORAC value of an antioxidant, that's really the measurement of the antioxidant capacity in a test tube. But what happens in the human body is a completely different thing. It's more complex. Sometimes the body is digesting those compounds into metabolites, and those are the active compounds. So the overall message is to not get too hung up on which one has more antioxidants, but just eat a variety and lots of them. So this is a portrait of an anti-inflammatory diet, and this is kind of based on some of the research out there looking at diet patterns and individual foods. First of all, it's a variety of foods. When you want to get lots of anti-inflammatory compounds, you want to eat a huge variety that has different kinds of phytochemicals and different kinds of compounds, different vitamins. Some of our vitamins are actually antioxidants, different kinds of minerals. So that means a variety, trying to expand beyond the few foods that sometimes people get stuck on. It's also low in refined, low nutrient foods. When we fill up our diets with low nutrient foods, then we're shoving out all those foods that are so rich in antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds. So it's really about making every bite count. If you really look at the way we used to eat hundreds of years ago, everything counted. Every bite of food that we ate was meaningful. And now we have so much room for low nutrient foods that provide little nutrient. And some of them are plant-based too. So we have to be more selective. Of course, high in fruits and vegetables. And Americans are doing miserably at fruit and vegetable intake. We're not getting nearly as much. Depending on what recommendation you look at, we're probably getting less than half what we should get on average. So we really need to push the fruits and vegetables. Not only are they rich in all these compounds we're talking about, but they're very low in energy. They can help with weight, healthy weight, and that also reduces chronic disease and inflammation. So we just talked about this and the fact that balancing the calories, keeping the weight at a healthy level is a huge part of reducing inflammation. And then healthy carbs, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but there is indication that an anti-inflammatory eating style should also include slow digesting carbs, things that aren't absorbed rapidly into the bloodstream. So those are things with lots of fiber, whole grains, legumes, things that have that nice slow response, glycemic response. Low in animal proteins, that's another indicator. And also high in plant proteins, things like legumes, soy foods, and nuts and seeds. Healthy fats, and when we talk about healthy fats, we're talking about things with mono and polyunsaturates, things like olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, unrefined plant oils. Those are the ones that we should be targeting. It includes omega-3 fatty acids. So for a plant-based diet, that would be things like walnuts and hemp and chia, soy. It's packed in antioxidants, spices, and herbs. This is one area that the spices and herbs are parts of plants that are so rich in anti-inflammatory compounds because they're very potent. Just a little bit gives you a lot. So this is something that we need to increase more. It's been found that in some studies, in some countries like India that have very high use of spices, they have lower rates of things like Alzheimer's disease. So it's an important part. If alcohol is consumed moderate, it should be moderate. Small amounts of dark chocolate as a treat. Dark chocolate is a plant food. We know when it's at least 70% and it's not including lots and lots of sugar and other additives. It's very high in anti-inflammatory compounds too. These are some beautiful anti-inflammatory foods at my farmer's market in Pasadena, where I live. Okay, let's look at some individual plant foods that are linked to lower inflammation. So these are some studies that have shown that fruits and vegetables lowered CRP. Whole grains, and this is one thing I think there's a lot of confusion right now on whole grains. There are people that think for some reason they're inflammatory, but the evidence isn't really there. The studies are showing that they lower inflammation. Soy foods have been linked to lower inflammation in studies. And this is a very interesting study that found that strawberries reduced the inflammation at a high-fat meal. So basically this researcher took a Western breakfast and then compared it with taking the same Western breakfast and adding strawberries. And strawberries blunted the inflammatory response. So it kind of negated the bad thing that they ate at breakfast, showing that when we eat more fruits and vegetables, it can actually help balance out the things that aren't so perfect. Okay, I wanted to look at soy in specific. There are some foods that have a lot of research on inflammation. There is epi data that shows soy intake lowers heart disease risk. And in fact, the FDA has a health claim that 25 grams of soy protein a day can reduce your risk of heart disease. And the thing that might be interesting is the isoflavones, which are the phytochemicals in the soy. That may be one of the intriguing areas about soy because they have been found to have anti-inflammatory effects. They act as antioxidants, and they have possible estrogen-like effects that inhibit pro-inflammatory cytokines. There was one study in European women that they gave them isoflavone bars, and they found that their CRP levels were lowered. So there's some research on soy in particular. And we also have data with soy and cancer. Populations that eat very high soy intake tend to have much lower breast and prostate cancer rates than we do. And soy does contain several anti-carcinogenic compounds like the isoflavones, saponins, and protease inhibitors. The soy isoflavones act as an antioxidant, and they regulate immune function. They have cancer suppressive activity. And the research is really looking at a whole foods approach with soy. It's not so much the isolated soy that's going into processed foods, but the whole soy. When we're looking at populations that consume a great deal of soy, they're eating it in its whole form. Things like edamame, tofu, soy milk, tempeh. And this whole foods approach seems to be what we should be looking for, because some of the studies that showed very high levels of the isolated soys actually stimulated the effects on tumors, which there's a lot of negative press on soy right now, and it's because of these early studies that show these high levels. But when you eat it as a whole soy food, there's better results, and it's safe. Now the American Cancer Society and the American Institute of Cancer Research say that soy is safe even for breast cancer survivors. A lot of people are not getting that message, but moderate soy consumption is safe. Oh, this is a picture of quinoa from my Santa Rosa Heirloom Expo, and this is the plant that quinoa grows on, another anti-inflammatory food. Okay, let's look at slow digesting carbs a little bit more. Studies have shown that low glycemic foods may reduce inflammation. An example, things like legumes would be a low glycemic carb. Berries, things that are high in fiber. So they have carbohydrates, but the fiber in the matrix of the food is slowing down the digestion. It doesn't get absorbed so rapidly. We have these nice, slow responses in the blood glucose, and that's what we should be aiming for. That's the benefit of choosing these kind of carbs. So it's not the amount of carbs, it's the quality of carbs that we need to focus on. And of course, we know that people are eating way too many refined carbs, things that are rapidly absorbed, things made out of white sugar and refined flour. They rapidly are absorbed and raise the glucose more sharply. In this particular study, they found that overweight men and women who ate a low glycemic diet for 1 month reduced their inflammation by 22% compared to those on the high glycemic diet. So this is really backing up this idea of healthy carbs. And these are heirloom beans at my farmer's market too in Pasadena. Legumes, I wanted to talk a little bit about. And when we say legumes, we're talking about beans, lentils, dried peas. These are really healthy foods. I like to say they're the ideal protein package because they're rich in protein, but they come with a lot of other great things, like fiber namely. Legumes are probably our richest source of fiber in the plant world. And we have all these organizations saying we need to eat more legumes. The American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, the American Cancer Society, they're all saying Americans need to eat more legumes. They've been linked with lower disease risk, healthier weight, and it's because of this wonderful protein package. And a lot of people don't realize that legumes can have phytochemicals. If you look at a black bean, it's the anthocyanin giving it that black color. So we can get phytochemicals from legumes as well. And whole grains. So when we eat the whole grain in its entirety, we're eating it the way nature intended, with the bran on the outer covering and then the wheat germ. But when we refine all those things away, we're left with just the starchy endosperm, which is rapidly digested and absorbed, and it produces this swing in glucose, which we don't want. We want that nice, slow response in the blood glucose. So when we eat whole grains in their natural form, they don't have that inflammatory response. And I really like to encourage people to have more whole grains in their intact form. So when you actually see the kernel of grain, as in the case of wheat berries, farro, quinoa, barley, you're actually simmering the whole grains and eating them that way rather than grinding them into the flour. Even when you grind a whole grain into a flour, it's going to be more rapidly absorbed. You're increasing the surface area. The more you make the particles smaller and smaller, the more rapidly they're absorbed, even if it has the bran and the germ. So really encouraging more consumption of the intact grains, which are getting more and more available. You're starting to see bins of whole grains in supermarkets more and more, all different kinds. So it gives people a variety, and really just simmering them, it's delicious. Hundreds of studies have found that whole grains, diets rich in whole grains, can reduce the risk of all sorts of diseases like stroke, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, asthma, colorectal cancer, obesity, even gum disease. So we have this big body of research on whole grains that have found these benefits. And now we're starting to think that maybe inflammation might be one of the reasons why, one of the many reasons why, because these foods are very high in fiber, and fiber is really good for us too. It has many benefits. But inflammation can be maybe one of those factors. In this particular study, they found that whole grains were linked to lower inflammation, refined grains were linked to higher inflammation. So we're just seeing this over and over again, this idea. Okay, fruits and vegetables. This is the area that's really intriguing. There's so many studies that are finding these compounds, those phytochemicals we were talking about, that reduce inflammation. In this particular study, they looked at Anthocyanin-Rich purple potatoes, and they reduced inflammation. They were linked with colorectal cancer protection. And then studies have looked at tomato products with that bright red lycopene, and they found that, almost like that strawberry study, when you give people tomatoes at a Western meal, it blunted that inflammatory and oxidative stress that occurred. So it kind of takes care of the bad effects of that meal. But it's not just purple and red, it's all of these different colors. That's why we tell people to eat from the rainbow. And this is an example of the groups of phytochemicals that are found in all the different fruits and vegetables. For instance, in the white and green, things like leeks and scallions and garlic and onions and celery, they have the allyl sulfides. That's the phytochemicals there, these sulfur compounds. And you can see that that group of vegetables are very pungent, lots of flavor and aroma. Scientists now know that the phytochemicals are actually attached to some of the flavor and aroma compounds. So in the case of the sulfur vegetables, that's where the phytochemical resides, the anti-inflammatory compounds reside with those flavor and aroma molecules. Very interesting. And we're finding that with spices too. That very thing that makes things spicy is the thing where all the anti-inflammatory compounds are. The green vegetables like broccoli and kale have glucosinolates and indoles. That's a very powerful group. These cruciferous vegetables especially have been linked with anti-cancer. And then we have the yellow-green. They have the lutein and the zeaxanthin phytochemicals. That's another whole group that's very interesting for eye protection. The flavonoids, cryptoxanthin in the orange-yellow vegetables, and then the carotenoids in the orange vegetables, things like carrots and cantaloupe and squash. The red-purple, the anthocyanins, and there's been a lot of research even with brain health with anthocyanins, very intriguing research there. And then we talked about lycopene in the red vegetables too. So having a variety of different colors is so important. And sometimes even moving beyond the varieties that we see in the supermarket. Because, for instance, in the case of carrots, plant researchers think the first carrot was not orange. They think it was probably white or purple, because that's what the wild carrots were. And if you buy heirloom carrots, you can find them in every color of the rainbow. And that means they have a different phytochemical profile. So by increasing the variety that we're getting, we're increasing that phytochemical variety as well, not always eating the same thing that you see every day. These are anthocyanin-rich plant foods, just in a little example. This is one group of foods that scientists are very excited about because the anthocyanins seem to be very powerful, this category of phytochemicals. And they have the black color, the blue-purple color, and sometimes the red color. They're found in things like blackberries, black beans, the red carrots, mission figs, blueberries, eggplant, the red apples, beets, blood oranges. There's just many different kinds of foods that have this red, blue, black, purple color in them. They've been studying this compound for many benefits, and one of the interesting ones that I mentioned was brain health, too. It's very interesting because when you look in nature, scientists were actually looking at examining the behavior of animals. And in nature, for instance, birds have this tendency to pile up on berries before they migrate. And they completely switch off their insect diets to go to berries before they migrate. And they're thinking that this might prepare them for this huge burden of migration. And the same thing with bears before hibernation, they will pile up on berries. It's a very intriguing concept with the anthocyanins. And even kohlrabi, this has anthocyanins when you buy the purple kohlrabi. So omega-3 fats. When you're on a plant-based diet, this is one area that can fall short because we think of omega-3 fats in fish. And indeed, they provide the EPA and DHA, which are the long-chain fatty acids. But we can make choices in our fat choices that can be good for inflammation or cause inflammation. Fats produce prostaglandins, and these can increase or decrease inflammation. Omega-3s are the good kind because they produce the anti-inflammatory ones. So when it comes to looking for plant sources, we can choose things like walnuts, flax seeds, chia seeds, even soy. There are a lot of foods that have the plant-based omega-3s, so that's something we can include more. Even probiotics have a link to inflammation. This is kind of new research here. Studies showed that probiotics reduce the inflammation in the gut and other parts of the body, and they can help with inflammatory diseases such as psoriasis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and ulcerative colitis. This has been found in studies. We need to learn a lot more about this. But we can get probiotics from fermented foods, which is growing in popularity, where we're actually introducing live active bacteria into the gut. There are also prebiotics, so it's not just the probiotics, but it's feeding the healthy gut bacteria by giving them lots of fiber, and these are some examples of the prebiotic foods. So this is another aspect of an anti-inflammatory diet. And then spices and herbs, which I touched on a little bit. One study found that rosemary, sage, and thyme retained the anti-inflammatory activity even after heating and digestion. And these have been well documented to have anti-inflammatory compounds. Turmeric is very popular right now, and the researchers at UCLA are studying it for Alzheimer's disease outcomes. But it's very high in anti-inflammatory compounds. And studies are showing that when you combine spices, it even magnifies the effect of spices. So when you combine two spices together, the synergistic effects are greater than the sum of the two. So this idea of having lots of spices in the diet, lots of flavorful things, is a beneficial one. These are padron peppers that I found at my farmer's market. Beautiful. And then we have some bonus foods, too, that are possibly anti-inflammatory. Things like tea. Green tea has gotten a lot of attention for its compounds. It has the epicatechins that are high in anti-inflammatory compounds. And then if people drink, the red wine has been linked with anti-inflammation because of the resveratrol. It is important to note that you can get resveratrol by eating grapes too, and even grape juice. And then, of course, the dark chocolate, because it comes from a plant food, cocoa beans. I like the idea that even the government's dietary recommendations are really plant-based. This is what the government recommends as a mainstream recommendation. My Plate, you've probably seen it, and it's telling people to fill their plate with 3/4 of plant foods. So even, the basic recommendations are increasing the plant foods. This is a Flickr My Plate tool. You can go onto Flickr and look this up, and this is where people have taken pictures of their interpretations of My Plate. And it's just so colorful, and this is all different ways you can eat a plant-based diet with all these colorful fruits and vegetable combinations. These are some of my plant-powered anti-inflammatory dishes that I think can be inspiring and delicious, because I believe that anti-inflammatory plant-based eating should be delicious. It shouldn't just be healthy. So things like brown rice sushi with seaweed and any kind of vegetable you can think of. A tortilla soup, a plant-based tortilla soup that lets people be a little interactive, putting the different toppings on the top. Pomegranate beet walnut salad with arugula. A French lentil salad that's very high in protein with an olive oil vinaigrette and cherry tomatoes. And then on the top here, a Southwest seasoned mango and black bean salad with quinoa. And it has cumin and turmeric for flavoring. Whole grain apple walnut muffins. And I want to leave this with you here. Physicians should consider recommending a plant-based diet to all their patients, especially those with high blood pressure, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, or obesity. And this was from a recent publication in 2013. So it's really becoming more of a mainstream idea that this is an option for reducing disease. And thank you very much. So I have time for a few questions if anybody has anything on anti-inflammatory eating. I might be able to hear you.
I can speak loudly enough that they may want it recorded.
Oh, that's true.
And I apologize for my general suchness of being, for I'm always up here provoking. Naturopathic medicine back in the late 70s, Jeffrey Bland and Ralph Weiss went on a national tour talking about itis to osis and alkaline acid diets. And the hallmark of their anti-inflammatory was the work of Bertrand Brenner and the Pasteur Institute, which Dr. Weiss repeated in his own lab to confirm. I've never seen it be altered, which is that there's a leukogenesis with all cooked foods. There's an inflammatory elevation, and my raw food vegan patients have historically had white blood counts that are below the low end of the curve, which I think, like the Framingham study, shows that our curve is an inflamed society. Their doctors constantly encourage them to eat animal-based products to get their white blood cells up there. I never hear raw discussed, I never hear organic discussed in these discussions, and I consider the inflammatory aspects of conventional foods to be a remarkable consideration in helping your patients. So that is my question. What do you think about the fact that other than humans, no animal on this planet eats cooked foods, and we started without them? And evidence-based research, though it's never proved the parachute safe or functional, and I would always choose to have one in Alaska, evidence-based has never reversed this aspect of the anti-inflammatory properties of raw foods. And Dr. Weiss's extension was raw food before a meal reverses that 7,000.1 hour elevation to 1,000. So if the strawberries came in before, the raw foods might be part of that. So thank you. Organic and raw, can you make some comments?
Well, I'm not really familiar with the work that you cited at the beginning of your comment, but and I haven't really seen any data, that really is comparing raw food versus cooked food in terms of a plant-based diet. I haven't seen that data. I would love to, if you know of any, I would love to look at it. But in my particular opinion, I do think there are benefits with raw foods, but I don't think that that's all we should eat. That's my particular professional opinion. I think that you can definitely see some benefits from raw foods. You can see higher nutrient values in many raw foods, but then some things benefit from the cooking process, things like whole grains and legumes. It decreases the anti-nutrients and that kind of thing. But from an inflammatory aspect, I don't really know the data, so I can't really speak on that. But my personal advice to people is to have lots of raw foods, because I think they are very beneficial, but that's not the only, they only have to be raw. That's my professional opinion. So I hope I answered your question.
I'm sure this is on. Excellent presentation, by the way. I was curious, there's a lot of promotion for low-fat diets that omit avocados, walnuts, the healthy fats. Is there a certain amount of fat or a certain percentage of fat in the diet in order for proper absorption of the fat-soluble antioxidants like lycopene?
Yeah, that's a good, there are different styles of plant-based diets right now, and my personal opinion is I have a moderate fat approach, because I think the data supports a healthy fat consumption, a moderate amount of healthy fat. I don't really see that the data supports the benefits of a very low fat diet. And I feel that when you're on a plant-based diet, particularly a 100% plant-based diet, it can be very low in fat. So the fat can be beneficial. And there is the benefit of absorption of nutrients. We know that certain fat-soluble nutrients like carotenoids do not get absorbed as well without the presence of fat. So I usually like to recommend somewhere in the 30% of fat range, 30% of calories. But I prefer to recommend the whole sources of plant fats, things like real nuts and seeds and avocados, a small amount of unrefined plant oils, like for instance, putting olive oil or avocado oil over salad, just a little bit. It doesn't take a lot. When I've analyzed a whole day's worth of plant-based menus, by the time you add 1 or 2 handfuls of nuts, which I recommend, and then some avocado, you're getting your fat levels up, and just a little drizzle in cooking is really all you need. It doesn't have to be dumped in, and you'll be right about at the 30% fat level. Can I help you?
Thank you for what you do. I've been reading research that suggests that the commercially raised fruits and vegetables that we can most easily buy in the stores have kind of been bred for shelf life and a pretty appearance, and they're breeding out the antioxidants because they want to make it less bitter for us, or they ripen in a better timed way to be able to deliver them. Should we be trying to get our seeds from alternate sources and growing them? Can you comment on the healthfulness of our fruits and vegetables that we can get, and what you would recommend?
That's a very intriguing area. I'm fascinated with agriculture. And there was a study done that they compared the nutritional value of fruits and vegetables today compared with 1950, and it's much lower. And it could be a result of many things. Some studies have shown that when we pick vegetables and fruits green, they don't get the same nutritional value as when they're picked ripe, which would make sense. They don't have the same phytochemical value. So it can get really depressing, because when you think about it, you think all these different things. And then there are studies that show that the wild relatives of plants are so much higher in phytochemicals than, the one that has been bred for all these qualities by the time that we get it in the supermarket. But the bottom line to me is we just have to eat more fruits and vegetables. And they are very high. I like to do an experiment with my own diet every once in a while where I actually analyze my whole diet pattern for a day, and I eat a traditional plant-based diet. It's off the charts in vitamins and minerals, and that's just my normal everyday diet. So I feel like we have to do our best that we can, but at the same time, I like the idea of exploring heirloom vegetables, going to the farmer's market where you see more colorful vegetables, see other varieties, and try to introduce more of these things because they are more potent. Also, eating things, when you're eating from the farmer's market, they're picked ripe. I went on a farm tour and I actually saw a tomato at the stage that it's picked in to go to the supermarket, and it was completely green and hard. that has to be picked 2 weeks early to make it to a supermarket, and that's why they taste the way they do. So when you're going to farmers markets or have a CSA or growing your own food, then you're getting it ripe and it has much higher levels of all that. So, thank you.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks again. This question was partially answered in a previous question, but I'd like to maybe get a more specific guideline as far as what you might give to somebody who's transitioning toward a plant-based diet. We see it now very strongly, the trend in the plant-based world to eliminate all oils, even extra virgin olive oil, even extra virgin coconut oil. And one thing is, I wonder if extra virgin coconut oil does in fact have an anti-inflammatory effect. And the other thing is, what guideline would you give specifically to somebody who maybe not, I mean, my experience is that people may feel very intimidated by going 100% whole foods right away. Could I get your take on that?
So yeah, that's, I think there are varying opinions on the fat aspect. I have a more moderate approach because I feel like the data supports a moderate fat diet, and so I include a little bit of fat. But my first recommendation, I think I mentioned, is the whole plant foods like nuts and seeds and avocados, but then a little bit, and my favorite fat is extra virgin olive oil. If you're buying extra virgin olive oil, it has not been heat treated. It still has anti-inflammatory compounds. In fact, the compound is oleocanthal that one study showed it's just as powerful as ibuprofen. So that's my favorite oil. But now you can find other unrefined oils. It used to be that was the only one you could find. Now you can find unrefined avocado oil and walnut oil and all these other ones. And when they're unrefined, they still have some of the anti-inflammatory compounds. So, but it's just a small amount to really get up to that healthy level. It doesn't have to be a large amount. I recommend, a teaspoon per meal to really be, in addition to nuts and seeds and avocados. So it's all you need. It's not a lot, but it's just enough to get a little flavor. I mean, if weight is not an issue, people can have even a little bit more. But if people are trying to keep a healthy weight, so that was one of the, can you remind me what your other question was? You had something else in there.
It was if coconut oil had anti-inflammatory effects.
Right. So coconut oil is a very hotly debated issue right now. There's not a lot of research that coconut oil is the magic cure that it's marketed to be. That my professional opinion is the research doesn't really match the hype right now. I just don't think we have enough research. Some studies are showing that populations that eat that oil do pretty well, and then other studies have shown that populations that are switching to that oil are starting to have type 2 diabetes and heart conditions. And the concern is it's very high in saturated fat. But we're learning more about saturated fat every day. I still feel that saturated fat needs to be limited. I feel like the evidence is really showing that we still need to keep saturated fat limited. However, now we know there are different kinds of saturated fats. So my recommendation with coconut oil is that could be one of your fats that you choose, but it should not be consumed like a tonic. Like some people are drinking it like medicine. I don't believe that there's enough evidence for that. But I believe it could be one of your forms of oil. When you're eating a plant-based diet, you get very little saturated fat. So if you look at it from a budget standpoint of your saturated fat for the day, then I think it could fit in. But I don't think it's a health tonic. So thank you. It's a good question. I think I have time for maybe one more question, and then I'll go.
Hi, Sharon. Thanks. So I'm trying to work through an idea here around inflammation and knowing that there is a beneficial ratio of the omega-6s to the omega-3 types of fats. And, when you're thinking about the plant-based nutrition, you're probably going to be taking a lower fat diet, so you don't have as many of the omega-6 fats in your diet as the typical Western diet. However, I know that you also need to have enough of the omega-3s, and when it's a plant-based diet, I know that a lot of the suggestions keep coming up, from walnuts and chia seeds and flax seeds. But I also think I remember that the omega-3s in those foods have a very low conversion rate to the actual DHA and EPA that are shown in research to have the anti-inflammatory benefits. So how do you kind of reconcile truly getting enough of the omega-3s unless you actually do take a supplement?
So ALA is the plant-based omega-3, and it has anti-inflammatory effects all on its own, just on its own. But ALA can be converted to EPA and DHA, which we know those are the super omega-3s. They're the ones with all the benefits, the brain benefits and everything else. And you can convert ALA into EPA and DHA in the body, but it's pretty low, maybe even below 10%. Although some studies show that when you decrease your omega-6s, things from the typical oils that are in American diets, like soybean oil and those kinds of things, you can increase your absorption, your conversion rate. And then other studies, this is something we need to learn a lot more about. Other studies have found that you can increase your conversion rate during certain times of life. For instance, pregnant women have a much higher conversion rate than non-pregnant women. So there are certain conditions that the body will convert at a higher rate. So we need to learn more about this whole conversion thing. But ALA on its own is anti-inflammatory. My recommendation is to really load up on the ALA through all these healthy things that we're probably eating anyway, like flax and soy and walnuts and hemp and all these things. Making sure you have a good source every day. And then you may want to consider doing a marine algae supplement, which now you can find marine algae supplements that are plant-based, and they have EPA and DHA. So that may be an alternative, but we don't really have a lot of research on how, the overall long-term effects of those. But they do have EPA and DHA, so that's something. But I think I have to go. It seems like, I don't know if I have time for one more.
You may be trying to get off the stage, and we'll honor that. But we do have a little bit more time.
Okay, so I'll just take.
Are you okay for that?
Oh yeah, I just
right.
didn't want to hold up your schedule.
Could you speak to plant-based nutrition and ALS? Specifically, I think I'd heard once that there was some suggestion that a high-fat diet might have some mitigating effects or slow down the progression. Do you have any thoughts on that very specific neuromuscular disease?
I'm sorry, I don't really have a lot on that. That's one area that I'm not really brushed up on, so I can't help with that one. I'm sorry. Does anybody else have a question? Looks like we have one more.
I was just wondering about soy intake during pregnancy
Okay.
and the safety of that.
So far, there's no indication that it's unsafe. I usually recommend one moderate soy intake, which is 1 to 2 servings a day, maybe even up to 3. The studies show that up to 3 can even be safe. So I don't have any qualms about recommending that. Right now, even for women that have had breast cancer, the recommendation is they can have moderate 1 to 2, maybe even up to 3 servings. And a serving is whole soy foods. Half a cup of tofu, a cup of soy milk, a half a cup of edamame, a half a cup of soy nuts, those kinds of things. So, yeah.
I have a question regarding that as well. And my son's been vegan for a couple years now, but he's only 12. So I kind of, I get back and forth with, oh gosh, is he going to eat too much soy? What's good, what's not? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, there's so much negative press on soy, and one of the things that's out there is that it causes feminization effects in males. I'm sure you've heard that, and there's really no data. There was some early research that was done where they gave animals high levels of isolated soy, and that's what started this whole buzz. But since then, there have been numerous studies that have found absolutely no feminization effects of moderate soy consumption in males. And in fact, studies have found that it can protect prostate cancer so there's actually a positive benefit for males. So right now, there is no evidence of that, but it's out there. I mean, everybody is talking about the feminization effects of soy. Just wish they would stop talking about that.
I just have a question about the Portland public school system and how, or if you know anything about increasing the plant-based diet in schools and.
Well, I'm not really sure what's going on here locally because I'm not from this area, but there is some interest. I'm seeing it all over when I'm out and about, that in the school system, I would like to see more data looking at young people, like what the incidence of vegetarianism is, if it's rising, because I'm seeing it on an anecdotal basis that more and more people are interested in plant-based diets in the younger population. And I know that the new dietary guidelines right now that's about to come out, that's our big government dietary recommendations where all the scientists get together and they look and see what we're going to do for the next set of guidelines. That's happening right now. And there's a lot of talk that this time it's going to have plant-based recommendations. The last one that came out actually did, for the first time, the last set of dietary guidelines actually said that vegetarian and plant-based diets have benefits, and that they actually recommended more plant proteins. That was the first time. So this time they're talking about that it's going to have more exposure, and that the school, once the dietary guidelines come out, that's when the school bases all of their nutrition recommendations on what happens in the dietary guidelines. So it all comes from there. So I do think that we're going to see more and more of that in the school systems. There was a recent study that just came out a couple weeks ago that 50% of Americans are trying to cut back on meat right now, consciously saying that they're trying to cut back on meat. So that's really encouraging. I think we're all set, right?
Great. Thank you so much. Let's give her a hand.